Hello, everyone. My name is Anton Grushetskyi. I am Executive Director of Kyiv International Institute of Sociology in Ukraine. And our institution is one of the leading Ukrainian sociological research institutions that are operating in Ukraine for more than 30 years. And we are tracing public moods and opinions in Ukraine. And we are glad to share some topics about Ukrainian society, its social structure, its values, and public opinion. In this lecture, we'll cover again several topics. Firstly, we'll say a few words about population statistics, about social structure. Then we'll turn our attention to values of Ukrainians, and then surely we'll discuss current public opinion towards war, because it's like the key feature of the current Ukrainian society. So let's start with first the most obvious topic, population of Ukraine. Let's be honest, no one will tell you for this moment what is the current population statistics in Ukraine. The last Ukrainian census was conducted more than 20 years ago in 2001. And actually, even before the 2014, Ukraine lacked reliable statistics. Millions of Ukrainians left of Ukraine as labor workers. We faced higher death rates than birth rates. We had some statistics. It was unreliable, but right now it's much more unreliable. But despite this, our Institute of Demography estimated Ukrainian population and proposed recently some figures. Firstly, we need to remember that 20 years ago, we had almost 49 million of Ukrainians. Before the full-scale invasion, we had 42 million of Ukrainians within borders 1991. Now in July 2024, we have 36 million of Ukrainians. And if you want to know the population number on the government-controlled areas, it's around 31 million of population. So you could see the sharp decrease of Ukrainian population, and mainly because of 6 million of Ukrainians who left Ukraine as refugees because of full-scale Russian invasion. And actually, demographic problem is one of the key problems for Ukrainian society for the next decades, because to recover demographically, it will be very hard for the Ukrainian society. Let's turn our attention to another point of structure of society. There are surely lots of different dimensions of social structure. We could discuss like occupational, some class structure. In this lecture, we just propose you briefly to look at this such topic as population well-being, how Ukrainians perceive their economic, their financial situations. In 1990s, Kyiv developed a question to measure how people evaluate their well-being. And actually, more than like almost 30 years ago, we conducted a large-scale survey for the World Bank. And then we saw a very high correlation between like numerous World Bank figures with only 1 hour single question. So then we started using only 1 hour single question because it was a very good indication of population well-being. And on this slide, you could see comparison of Ukrainian well-being before the full-scale invasion and after full-scale invasion. And actually, we should be honest, then after full-scale invasion, the perception of Ukrainians' well-being deteriorated. But right now, in 2024, it turned to the indications that we had before the full-scale invasion. For this moment, we have approximately 36% of Ukrainians who describe themselves as poor people. We have 38% of Ukrainians who describe themselves as like having average income, and 24% of Ukrainians describing themselves as having higher incomes or being more wealthy, more prosperous population. Almost the same figures we had before the full-scale invasion, and it's a very interesting question because objectively the economic situation became much worse. But for this moment, Ukrainians lowered their expectations, their demands, and saying like, there are lots of people in trenches. They're feeling much worse than we like in some not frontline cities. We have lots of civilians in the frontline community. So perhaps everything not as bad as someone could think. And actually, it's one of the indications of Ukrainians' resilience. For this moment, we do not see ourselves like as a poor relatives who are like starving to death in Ukraine. We still have enough internal resources to continue resisting to Russia and to live normal lives as it possible for these moments. Another very important topic to cover in this short lecture is values, because surely Ukraine is struggling for its better future, and for more than 10 years, Ukraine is struggling for its European future. But what about European values? Surely you could see like numerous surveys on values, like European Social Survey, World Value Survey, based on surveys in Ukraine. But it's the tricky thing is that perception of values is very context-based in Ukraine. In 2022, we conducted a split sample experiment, and half of respondents were asked a question: which values you prefer? Do you prefer like Western values, or you prefer traditional Ukrainian values? And in this case, we have like 78% of Ukrainians saying we prefer traditional, good Ukrainian values, and only 12% who prefer the good Western values. The other half of respondents were asked a question: do you prefer traditional values for the Eastern Slavs, Ukrainians, Russians, and Belarusians, or modern Western values? In this case, we see much less support for traditional values and much higher support for the Western values. So when Ukrainians think of traditional values of something like close to Russian scrapy or some like Russian traditional values, Ukrainians don't like it. But if Ukrainians contrast our values versus like European values, the majority of Ukrainians say, no, we have our own good Ukrainian traditional values. But it's important to understand that so the people cannot define what are traditional Ukrainian values is. And it's one of the key problems for the future, because we are defining our civic nation, we are defining our future, but we should define what our values should be in our like modern Ukrainian nation. Regardless of these values discussions, more than 90% of Ukrainians say that Ukraine should be a fully functioning democracy. And actually, it's like a stable indication over the last years. And we see that like Ukrainians not just want to win the war, or to survive the war. Ukrainians want to build a prosperous state right here. And one of the most important part is to create and to develop a good democracy for the Ukraine and for Ukraine and Ukrainians. And it's very important, and it's a very strong signal to our Western allies to show that like we want to be not just part like of some security alliance or some economic alliance. We want to be a part of value alliance where the democracy is one of the core values for everyone. Lots of people are discussing Ukrainians as a nation, and actually it poses lots of problems because Ukraine is all blamed for lots of even scientists, like a failed state or some state with problems, for example, with its civic identity. Even like Samuel Huntington and other prominent scientists wrote about Ukraine, saying like Ukraine is a divided society. But actually, we are working in Ukraine for more than 30 years, and surely there were lots of points of discussion. But at the same time, we see growing tendency of perceiving themselves, the Ukrainians, as a single nation. So we could criticize some government, we could criticize some policies, but from year to year, we see more and more people identifying themselves as a part of Ukrainian nation. And for more than 30 years, our State Institute of Sociology asking a question about who do you consider yourself in the first place. It's a national territorial identification, and the respondents could choose between like, I am just resident of my city or village, I am resident of my region, ranging to like, I am resident of the whole world. In this case, for example, in 1992, we had like slightly more than 40% of Ukrainians who consider themselves as citizens of Ukraine in the first place. The half of population perceive themselves as like more regional and more local identities. Like I'm just resident of city of Kharkiv, I'm resident of city of Lviv, I'm a city of Kyiv, etc. But then we see this growing tendency. After the Orange Revolution and before Revolution of Dignity, before 2014, we see 50% of Ukrainians saying we are citizens of Ukraine. After Revolution of Dignity and before large-scale invasion, we see 60% of Ukrainians saying that we are citizens of Ukraine. After the full-scale invasion, we see like 80% of Ukrainians saying we are citizens of Ukraine. So on the one hand, surely it's true that full-scale invasion made this process quicker. More and more Ukrainians started thinking we are Ukrainians in the first place. But actually, even before Russian invasion, it was like a evolutionary normal process for Ukrainians to improve our self-esteem and our perception as Ukrainians. Surely there are lots of work should be done more, because we cannot say we already have like formed civic nation. There are lots of should be done, but for this moment we see this unity. And actually we are limited in space and time, but I could say that in all Ukrainian regions for this moment, the majority says we are Ukrainians, regardless of ethnicity, of the language usage, etc. So it's very important for our future. But again, we could think of ourselves as Ukrainians, but what about like immigration attitudes? Because like I love Ukraine, but I love Ukraine from abroad. It's quite a wide popular belief in Ukrainian attitude. So we ask a question, do you have a desire to move to live abroad? And actually in 2020, so 2 years ago before the full-scale invasion, we had almost 30% of Ukrainians who wanted to leave Ukraine and to live in the West. It was very disastrous figures for Ukraine, unfortunately. And actually among the youngest Ukrainians, approximately 50% wanted to leave Ukraine. After the full-scale invasion, we had only 7% wanted to leave Ukraine. Surely, partly it's because lots of Ukrainians left Ukraine as refugees, but we made different calculations, and even given this, like lots of millions of people who left Ukraine, still we see this decrease in intentions to leave Ukraine. Again, because of higher perception and feeling as Ukrainians and strong desire to stay here, to protect Ukrainian land, and again, to build Ukraine as a prosperous Western modern state. Unfortunately, this year we have higher figures, and for this moment, 19% of Ukrainians want to leave Ukraine and to live in the West. There are higher percentage among the younger people, lower among the older Ukrainians. But again, as sociologists and as people who live in Ukraine, we pay more attention to the figures that 79%, despite all the problems, are still saying we want to stay in Ukraine. So despite all the problems, despite all uncertainty of the future, the majority of Ukrainians tie themselves to Ukraine and want to stay in Ukraine. When we are discussing political military situations, international relations, we need to understand the sources of information, because media landscape, it's something that affects hugely people's lives, because the majority of Ukrainians are not involved directly in, for example, in communication with policymakers, in some military commanders, and receive information through media. And actually, Ukraine, for example, like Francis Fukuyama, in one of his books published right before the invasion, described Ukraine as a state where oligarchs controlled all the media landscape through controlling TV channels. But after the full-scale invasion, we see dramatic change in situation. For this moment, the majority of Ukrainians receive the information from digital channels. Mainly, they receive information from Telegram channels, slightly less, but also through YouTube channels. And actually, the minority of Ukrainians watch TV, and particularly they watch United Marathon TV broadcast. And it's important because when we even conducted more in-depth studies, we saw that even those who watch TV, they watch TV as a background. For example, doing the housework, like doing their job. So not now, no serious attention. The majority says like, we are reading some news websites, we are reading Telegram channels. And from the one hand, we feel like these thousands of different sources of information and this free speech. On the other hand, almost 80% of Ukrainians say they are confident they could distinguish high-quality information from disinformation and fakes. So Ukrainians highly overestimate their responsibility and their huge possibilities to be influenced through the Telegram and YouTube channels. And it poses like lots of problems for Ukraine for the future with informational security. And about the topic, perhaps the most important for this history period in Ukraine, it's a current public opinion towards war, large-scale war with Russia. First of all, it's one of the key questions: do Ukrainians believe in Ukraine's victory? And the most recent survey conducted by Center Rosenkov, it's also one of the most reputable sociological institutions in Ukraine, shows that 83% of Ukrainians say that they still believe in Ukraine's victory. But the next question is what the victory is. because there like no single point of view how Ukraine's victory should look like. So we have surely Zelensky formula, we have some other ideas, but what Ukrainians think about it? And as you could see, Ukrainians also didn't have consensus how the victory should look like. Out of those who believe in Ukraine's victory in general, approximately half of Ukrainians say that they want restoration of the full territorial integrity of Ukraine, or even like having hostilities in the Russian regions. And after the restoration of the full territorial integrity. At the same time, approximately 30% of Ukrainians say that for them, victory could include a temporary cessation of some territories. Ukrainians say it's like pragmatic point of view. We cannot liberate some territories for this moment. We could postpone liberation for future. But even if we just preserve our independence, even with some limited borders, but like as a part of a Western community, it will be enough to say we are victorious in this war, because our previous wars ended with total loss of independence and sovereignty. So perhaps we don't need to restore territorial integrity right now, but postpone it for future. It's a very painful question, actually. And the next slides will show more information on this topic. But it should be understood that, again, it's a point for discussion within Ukrainians and also to discuss with our international partners. At the same time, when we're discussing war, we cannot omit discussing our Western allies, because Ukrainians, as you could see, like believe in Ukraine's victory, but at the same time, more than 80% say that Ukraine is able to achieve success in this war in case West provides Ukraine with the necessary financial, military, and sanction support. So again, despite all the problems Ukrainians faced over the last years, Ukrainians are still confident there are possibilities to achieve success. But Ukrainians understand there is crucial dependence on the Western allies. And actually, this perception of behavior of our Western allies causes lots of frustration for Ukrainians, because on the one hand, Ukrainians believe we could achieve success. On the other hand, the question if the West wants Ukraine to achieve success. And our next slide shows information about what Ukrainians should about Western policy towards Ukraine. Is the West our like true partner, or the West is like wants unjust peace from Ukraine and wants to put a pressure on Ukraine just to end the war, like even for not very good conditions for Ukraine? And actually, we see quite negative dynamics over the last 2 years. 2 years ago, only 15% of Ukrainians believed the West wanted unjust peace from Ukraine and wanted Ukraine just, for example, to cede some territories just to end the war. Right now, we have 38% of Ukrainians. Surely, we could say that for this moment, 54% of Ukrainians believe the West is still our true partner, but the tendency is quite negative. And when we see some election results in the West, they also cause lots of frustration among Ukrainians. So it means like we have the possibility to win the war. We have enough motivated people, enough motivated civilian population, enough volunteers, but like without weapons from the West and some support, we will not be able to achieve success. And surely for this moment, it causes lots of frustration among the population. Since the beginning of invasion, we started asking questions about general readiness for territorial concessions, because since the first day of invasion, there were lots of discussions like, should Ukraine cede some territories just to end the war? Perhaps let Russia still control Crimea or some parts of other Ukrainian regions just to end the war. And we didn't ask about specific territories. It was just an emotional reaction. Should the territories be like a part of concessions, or like no concessions that will include territorial loss of Ukraine? And till May 2023, till before failed counteroffensive of 2023, less than 10% of Ukrainians were ready for some territorial concessions. For this moment, we have 33%. Again, on the other side, despite all the problems, we have 56% saying there should be no territorial concessions. Again, we have lots of problems, lots of uncertainty, and we still have the majority saying no concessions to Russia. And again, it's showing some this resilience and understanding that situation is very complex, and there are just no possibility to give up fighting because Ukrainians will face new problems in the future. But again, it could be used by our Western partners who want to put a pressure on Ukraine, or used by Russian propaganda, but also by some Ukrainian subjects inside Ukraine, just to like destabilize public opinion. And it's very problematic situations for future. And we hope our authorities understand this and will make some steps to fight these problems. But when we are discussing these possible peace deals, one of the key problems is that any peace deal will include something good and something bad for Ukraine when we are talking about compromise. And you could find like lots of surveys conducted in Ukraine with the question wording like, and we also did such surveys, should Ukraine cede some territories to end the war? For example, cede Crimea, cede Donbass, or some other territories. And you could find like 80% of Ukrainians are like against ceding any territories. And these surveys are totally right. But in our survey this summer, we asked respondents about possible packages. And these packages included something good and something bad. For example, the first package included like losing all the territories that already occupied by Russia, ban for joining NATO, but at the same time joining European Union and receiving financing for rebuilding Ukraine. In this case, we have like only 38% of Ukrainians who were ready to accept such a peace deal. At the same time, 54% were against such a peace deal. But situation changes dramatically in case Ukraine receives NATO membership. In this case, 47% of Ukrainians could accept without enthusiasm, but could accept such a peace deal with 38% against it. And again, and in case Ukraine receives NATO membership and liberation of the southern Ukraine, Zaporizhzhia and Kherson Oblast, almost 60% of Ukrainians could accept such a peace deal. And the general interpretation is that the majority of Ukrainians, it's very painful to postpone liberation of some territories. But the key priority for this moment is security. Ukrainians do not want peace at any cost. Ukrainians need some security guarantees, and only with security guarantees from the West, Ukrainians could discuss some negotiations, because there are like negotiations that will not involve some security for Ukraine, will be like abandoned by Ukrainians and will not be supported. And we are discussing security guarantees, and we understand that it's a matter of our relations with the Western world. And for many years, we asking Ukrainians, do they support joining European Union? Do they support joining NATO or some other unions? And this graph shows the percentage of Ukrainians who support joining European Union and joining Union of Russia and Belarus over the last 20 years. Just to understand that there are different ways how we could ask this question, and in this case we asked what is called a referendum question. So we wanted to calculate the number of Ukrainians who had the proactive position. I'm not just supporting European Union, but I'm willing to visit polling station and like to vote for joining European Union. And we see that after 2014, after Revolution of Dignity, there was in general increase in joining European Union. And for this moment, we have almost 70% of Ukrainians saying that they are not just willing to join European Union, but they are also willing to visit polling stations and vote for joining it. At the same time, we have only 2% of Ukrainians who for this moment are ready for joining Ukraine to the Union of Russia and Belarus, while 15 years ago, more than half of Ukrainians were ready to join some union of Belarus and Russia. But we need a disclaimer right here, because lots of people could say, wow, Ukrainians wanted to join the Union of Russia and Belarus. Wow, it's like incredible. But the truth is that the majority of Ukrainians saw Ukraine as an equal part of this union with Russia and Belarus. They saw Ukraine as independent state and as a part of this union, not as some federal subject of Russian Federation, but independent like partner of Russia. But Ukrainians disillusioned with Russia, and now they like categorically support joining European Union and NATO. And with another question, we asked, should Ukraine by 2030 become a member of European Union and NATO? And we have 90% support for joining European Union and 84% for joining NATO. Again, less Ukrainians are ready to express this attitude through voting in elections, but still it's the absolute majority. What is more important, when Ukraine was described as like failed state or divided country, it was first of all described of different geopolitical intentions of the residents from the different regions. And on this graph, we show how Ukrainians are overcoming these regional differences. And in reality, before 2014, it's a left part of this graph, we could see that still we had the majority in the West supporting joining European Union, and the majority in the East who were against joining European Union. After annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass, the situations changed because in all regions we saw increase in support of joining European Union, but at the same time, still in the south and in the east, there were lots of people who were first of all against or hesitating about European Union. But look at this graph. It's our figures after the full-scale invasion about joining European Union and NATO in all regions, from the west to the east, from the Ukrainian-speaking to Russian-speaking Ukrainians, from ethnic Ukrainians to Russian Ukrainians. The absolute majority says Ukraine should be part of both European Union and NATO. We do not show this question right here, but even when we ask a question, which union is priority number one for Ukraine, the majority says NATO, even over European Union, because it's like a matter of security. It's like 20 years ago, it was unimaginable because only a small share of Ukrainians supported joining NATO. But right now, NATO, it's like it's a national idea of Ukrainians finally receive some good security guarantees of Ukraine. And again, another vector that is important to discuss is attitude towards Russia. One of the most widespread Russian propaganda myth is that Ukrainians were full of hatred toward Russians and Russia needed to act against like Ukrainian Nazism. Our institution, like many other institutions, for many years ask a question, what is your attitude towards Russia in general? And before 2014, before the Revolution of Dignity, from 80 to 90% of Ukrainians said that they had favorable view of Russia. We have only marginal minority, and actually minority in all the regions, who had negative view towards Russia. And only after occupation of Crimea and only after a war in the Donbass region, the attitude towards Russia worsened. But even before the full-scale invasion in February 2022, 34% of Ukrainians had positive view towards Russia. It was quite high figures. And actually, in other survey, 80% said that they had favorable view of ordinary Russians, saying like, we blame Kremlin for some problems, but ordinary Russians are innocent. And you look at the figures right now. Right now, more than 90% of Ukrainians have negative view towards Russia in general, and only 3% having positive view of Russia. And if you ask about ordinary Russians, we have more than 80% saying they have negative view of ordinary Russians. So at this point, like Russia is dead in the eyes of Ukrainians in all the regions, both as a state and as a people and as Russian culture. And you could say, why? Why they're dead? They're like our neighbors, our former colleagues, classmates. We just visited Russia as tourists, etc. But look at this figure. In May 2023, we asked a question, do you have some close family members or friends who were wounded or even killed because of full-scale Russian invasion? And it was a year ago, and we already had almost 80% saying they have at least one family member or close friend who were wounded or killed because of Russian invasion. The mean number of such like your friends or relatives is 7, ranging from 5 to 8, depending on the region, but it's huge figures. And behind these huge figures, there are huge emotions. If you lose your beloved ones, so it's a very huge like emotional impact for you. And that is why it's like Ukrainians will not forgive Russians, and like without Russians taking some efforts to ask Ukrainians for forgiveness. But what we see right now, they will not do this, and that is why there's like pure hatred in all the regions. So it's very important because lots of people think like Ukrainians in the West have some warm feelings towards Russia. It's not true. Surely we have some marginal minority who are like supporting truly Russians, but it's only a minority for this moment. And let's end our lecture with like more optimistic slide. It's happiness level. And also for me, for more than 20 years, we are tracing happiness levels in Ukraine. And while in 2001, we have only 38% of Ukrainians who considered themselves as happy people, now we have 63% of happy Ukrainians. And it's very important because After the full-scale invasion, the figure dropped, but dropped not so seriously and significantly. So we could have expected much more people saying that we are unhappy because it's full-scale war. Our like friends, relatives in the army, like fighting, our civilian family members are dying because of attacks and shellings. But we still see the majority saying we are happy despite all the problems. Again, it's an expression of our resilience for this moment, and it sends strong signal inside the society, saying we are not failed state, we are normal European civic nation, we are developing, but we are normal nation, and it's strong signal to our Western partners showing that Ukraine is willing and Ukrainians willing to resist and continue fighting. And for some final remarks for this presentation, some final conclusions. Surely we have numerous conclusions, but the conclusion number one is that for this moment we already have civic Ukrainian nation. Lots of things should be done for future, surely, but for this moment it's a fact that we already have civic Ukrainian nation. The fact is that we overcome some problems and problems that divided us before, like our geopolitical choice. It's the absolute majority says that we should be part of European Union and NATO. What is more important, in our society, the pro-Russian vector lost its attractiveness, and actually it died, because before lots of Ukrainians had some warm feelings or belief we should collaborate with Russia. For this moment, it's the only way towards the West for Ukraine. For this moment, we're still highly resilient. Lots of Ukrainians, despite all the problems, are still willing to resist Russian aggression. But at the same time, there are some possible problems for the future. First of all, it's our value formation and lots of space for populist movements, because lots of Ukrainians, because of these problems, are willing to having easy recipes for complex problems, or joining union, etc. Secondly, our general values, because changing our traditional values towards more suitable for the Western world, it's some necessity should be done. And surely, for this moment, we are still united, but for the future, the main fault line could be your position and what you do during the war. Because we have lots of people in trenches, we have lots of people in the civilian societies, lots of people left Ukraine as refugees, lots of people are living civilian lives, and for the future it could cause different experiences, and it's already shaping different experiences of war, and it could have some negative consequences, and it's work for the whole society to avoid these negative consequences for the future. And we as an institution and other sociologists in Ukraine will continue working on gathering high quality data, and we also recommend to contact us to receive this information, because it's high quality and very good to understanding current trends in society. And in the next lecture, you will see more information about the global Ukrainian community, which is also very important to understand current trends with our issue we are discussing.